Welcome back. Before we start, let me ask you something. Have you ever watched a hard surface modeling tutorial where the instructor finishes an amazing model, but you're left wondering, wait, how did they even get there? Well, in today's tutorial, we're doing things differently. Over the next couple of hours, we'll build this stylized aircraft completely from scratch. No skipped steps, no magical time lapses, and no just do this moments. I'll explain not only what I'm doing, but also why I'm doing it. So grab a cup of coffee, open Blender, and let's start modeling. All right, let's begin by adding our very first object. Press Shift+A, go to Mesh, and add a cylinder. It doesn't look exciting at all, but don't judge it yet. Almost every hard surface model starts from a primitive shape. Now jump into Edit mode. Select the end faces that we don't need and simply delete them. We're only interested in the outer shell for now. Next, select this edge loop. Move it slightly along the Y-axis, then scale it down just a little. Let's right-click and choose Shade Smooth. This doesn't actually change our geometry, but it makes the model much easier to read while we're working. Now, press A to select everything inside Edit mode. Scale everything slightly along the X-axis. I'm simply stretching the body so it feels longer and closer to the aircraft's overall proportions. Now here's a little trick that will save us a lot of work. Since this aircraft is symmetrical, there's absolutely no reason to model both sides manually. Let's delete one half of the mesh. After that, add a mirror modifier. From now on, every change we make on one side will automatically appear on the other. Think of it as having Blender work alongside you. And honestly, if Blender's willing to do half the work, I'm not gonna stop it. Again, press Shift+A, cylinder. Rotate it 90 degrees on the X-axis, just like before. Scale it up slightly because this part is going to form the front section of our aircraft. Press Shift+Z so we can move it freely in the XY plane. Position it roughly where the front should be. Don't spend too much time trying to make it perfect. Getting the overall placement is enough for now. We'll refine everything later. Now enter Edit mode. Select half of this cylinder, delete it, and once again add a mirror modifier. See the pattern? Whenever something is symmetrical, mirror modifier becomes your best friend. Let's start giving this cylinder some personality. Select these faces. Scale them to 0 on the X-axis. This helps flatten that area and gives us a cleaner starting surface. Before adding any bevels, I'm going to apply the object scale. This is one of those habits that seems unnecessary until Blender suddenly decides your bevel should explode into another dimension. Now select the top faces. Scale them down slightly. Next, press S, then Z, then 0. This straightens everything along the Z-axis and gives us a cleaner surface. At this point, I'm mostly experimenting with the shape. Don't worry if yours doesn't look exactly like mine. Modeling is a conversation between you and the mesh. Sometimes the mesh wins. Sometimes you do. Today, hopefully we win. Now let's remove these extra faces because they aren't contributing to the final shape. Cleaning unnecessary geometry early always makes life easier later. Select this edge loop, move it along the Y-axis, then press E to extrude. Scale it down slightly. Now, rotate around your model for a second. This is something I do constantly. Never trust only the front view. A model can look amazing from one angle. Then you rotate the camera, and suddenly it looks like a potato. Always check from multiple angles. Everything looks good? Great! Let's continue. Extrude once more along the Y-axis. Scale it down again. We're gradually building the aircraft nose, instead of trying to force the entire shape in one step. Small changes usually produce cleaner results. Now I'm selecting these side faces. I'll insert another edge here. This gives us more control over the silhouette. Remember, only add geometry when you actually need more control. Adding unnecessary edge loops is one of the easiest ways to make your mesh harder to edit later. Now let's extrude this section. Move it slightly along the x-axis. Add another loop cut, then extrude again. At the moment, I'm not focusing on tiny details. I'm simply building large forms. Large shapes first, medium shapes second, small details last. Following this order keeps the modeling process much cleaner. Now I'm adjusting the position of these vertices. This is one of those parts where patience really pays off. A few pixels here, a few pixels there. It may not seem like much, but all those tiny adjustments eventually add up to a much better model. Here, I'm merging these two vertices together. Since we don't need these extra edges anymore, I'll delete them. There's also a hidden face inside the model. Let's remove that as well. Hidden faces don't usually cause problems immediately, but they definitely become annoying later during UV unwrapping and texturing. Now select these faces. Scale them slightly along the y-axis and move them forward. Looking at the silhouette, I think this section feels a little too thick, so I'm going to make it slightly thinner. This is something you'll see me do throughout the tutorial. I'm constantly stepping back, looking at the overall proportions, making tiny corrections, then continuing. Don't get attached to your first shape. If something looks wrong, change it. No model becomes great by refusing to make adjustments. All right, we've established the basic body and the front section of our aircraft. It still looks pretty simple, but that's exactly how hard surface modeling works. First, we build a solid foundation. Only after the major forms look correct do we start adding interesting details. Let's add another cylinder. Just like before, rotate it 90 degrees on the x-axis so it aligns with the aircraft. Now select the faces that we don't need and delete them. We're only interested in keeping the outer shell because it'll be much easier to shape this way. Next, grab these edge loops and move them slightly along the y-axis. Instead of leaving the opening empty, press F to fill the gap. This gives us a starting surface to continue modeling from. I'll add another edge loop through the middle and fill the remaining section as well. Keeping the topology simple here will make future edits much easier. Before I start beveling these edges, I'm going to apply the scale once again. If you've watched a few Blender tutorials before, you've probably heard this advice many times. Now select these edges and give them a small bevel. Nothing dramatic, just enough to soften the transitions. Remember, even tiny bevels help the model catch highlights during rendering. Some of these edges aren't perfectly aligned. I'm selecting a few faces, scaling them to 0, and making this surface perfectly straight. Now I'm going to use inset. This creates another loop inside our selected faces. Once that's done, I'll delete those inner faces completely. Now select the border edges. Press E to extrude along the y-axis. Scale them down slightly. This immediately starts giving the object some depth instead of feeling like a flat surface. Since this part is symmetrical, let's add another mirror modifier. Now we're going to create another cylindrical object. Instead of modeling everything from cubes, sometimes cylinders simply make life easier. Move the 3D cursor into position. Press Shift+A and add another cylinder. Delete the faces once again, so we're only working with the shell. Select everything. Now extrude. Instead of scaling normally, I'm using Alt+S. If you've never used Alt+S before, it scales geometry along its normals rather than the global axes. It's incredibly useful for maintaining even thickness on rounded objects. You'll probably find yourself using this shortcut a lot once you get comfortable with Blender. Let's add another cylinder. Adjust its location. Scale it until it feels proportional. Again, don't chase perfection. We're just establishing forms. Now, delete half of the mesh. Inset, extrude, inset again, and finally add another mirror modifier. One thing you'll notice is that I'm constantly switching between adding new geometry and adjusting old geometry. That's completely normal. Hard surface modeling isn't linear. You'll often revisit older pieces as the model evolves.
Select these faces. Instead of extruding outward, this time we're extruding inward. These little recessed details help break up large flat surfaces. Flat surfaces tend to make stylized models look boring. Even simple insets can add a lot of visual interest.
Now, let's add a cube. Scale it until it roughly matches the reference. Nothing fancy here. We're simply blocking out another mechanical component. Don't spend 5 minutes trying to make a cube perfect. You'll probably reshape it several times before we're done anyway. I'm using Shift+S to move the 3D cursor exactly where I want. The 3D cursor is one of Blender's most underrated tools. Many beginners ignore it, but once you get used to positioning objects from the cursor, your workflow becomes much faster. Now, let's add another cylinder. This time, I'll increase the number of segments slightly because I want a smoother circular profile. Scale it down and position it where it's needed. I'm adding another edge loop, deleting half of the mesh, then adding another mirror modifier. One important thing here, don't forget to enable clipping. Otherwise, your center vertices can slide past each other, and you'll end up wondering why your model suddenly has a crack running down the middle. Let's insert another edge loop. Inset, extrude. Nothing complicated. We're simply building depth one step at a time. Notice how each operation adds just a little more definition. You don't need giant changes. Lots of small improvements usually produce much cleaner results. might notice me deleting geometry almost as often as I create it. That's completely normal. Modeling isn't about adding more polygons. It's about adding the right polygons. Sometimes the delete key is just as important as the extrude key. Now, let's add a round cube. I'm using relatively low segments because I don't need an extremely dense mesh. Shade it smooth. Immediately, it starts looking much cleaner. Remember, more polygons don't automatically make better models. Good shapes make better models. I'm selecting these faces, pressing P, and separating them into a new object. Why? Because it's much easier to work on certain pieces independently. Trying to edit everything as one object eventually becomes frustrating. Breaking complicated models into smaller pieces keeps everything manageable. Now, let's make this object more circular. Extrude slightly inward. Delete the inside faces because nobody's ever going to see them. There's no point wasting polygons on hidden geometry. You'll hear me say this quite often throughout the tutorial. I'm pressing Ctrl 1 to quickly add a subdivision modifier. Looking at it? Actually, we don't need subdivision for this particular object, so let's remove it. One thing I always encourage is experimenting. Try modifiers, see what happens. If they don't improve the model, remove them. Nothing wrong with testing ideas. Select these faces. Extrude them. Scale them down slightly. Now, let's add a couple of supporting edge loops. Move them upward. Finally, add a small bevel. See how much nicer those corners look? Tiny adjustments like this make hard surface models feel intentional instead of blocky. There are a few unnecessary faces hiding inside. Let's delete those. Keeping your mesh clean now saves hours later during UVs and texturing. It's one of those boring habits that every professional artist eventually develops. Let's add another cube. Scale it down, stretch it slightly along the y-axis. Make it thinner. Then add another edge loop. Now select the last face. Turn on proportional editing. Rotate it gently until it matches the shape we're after. One important thing, make sure your pivot point stays in the center of the wheel. Otherwise, the rotation won't behave the way you expect. At this point, our aircraft is finally starting to feel like a machine instead of a collection of random cylinders and cubes. We've added several secondary components, created cleaner mechanical forms, and continued building the overall silhouette. Don't worry if yours still doesn't match mine perfectly. Every artist makes tiny adjustments during modeling. In fact, I'm probably going to change a few things myself before this tutorial is over. That's just part of the creative process. Take a moment to save your project. Maybe stretch a little. Your back will thank you. Instead of rebuilding everything from scratch, I'm simply selecting the wheel assembly we've already created and duplicating it. And one thing I want to mention, there's absolutely nothing wrong with reusing your own work. Sometimes beginners think every object has to be modeled from scratch. Professional artists duplicate parts all the time. Why? Because consistency is important. If one wheel already looks good, there's no reason to spend another 20 minutes trying to make an identical one. So I'll duplicate it, position it where I need it, and we'll make small adjustments later if necessary. At one point, we could simply add another mirror modifier for this section, but I'm going to leave that for later because I want a little more control while positioning everything. Now I'm stepping back and looking at the silhouette. This section feels a little off. Nothing major, just one of those little things your eyes eventually notice. Let's add another cube. Scale it down, move it roughly into position. At this point, I'm not chasing details. I'm simply blocking out another mechanical component. Think of it like building with Lego. We're creating all the major pieces first, then we'll worry about making them look pretty. Now I'm deleting half of the cube because, you guessed it, mirror modifier. We're going to save ourselves another 50% of the work. Let's begin shaping it. Move a few vertices, scale a couple of faces, adjust the profile until it starts matching the design. Again, don't panic if yours isn't identical. The important thing is understanding the workflow.
While shaping this piece, I noticed a couple of faces that aren't helping us anymore. Rather than leaving unnecessary geometry inside the model, I'm deleting them now. It's much easier to keep a mesh clean than it is to clean it later. You'll thank yourself during UV unwrapping.
It's funny. Sometimes I'll spend 10 minutes moving vertices by just a few millimeters. Then I'll compare the before and after, and somehow the model looks 10 times better. That's modeling. Actually, now let's insert another edge loop. Move it into position. Next, I'll bevel these edges. One quick reminder, whenever your bevel looks strange, before assuming Blender is broken, check whether you've applied the object's scale. 9 times out of 10, that's the problem. I'm also switching the bevel profile to %. It gives me a shape that fits this object a little better. I noticed a couple of unnecessary edges here. Let's dissolve those. Now I'm reconnecting the surrounding geometry. The goal is to avoid creating n-gons wherever possible. If you're not familiar with n-gons, they're simply faces with more than 4 sides. Sometimes they're perfectly fine. Sometimes they completely ruin your subdivision. So I prefer cleaning them while I'm modeling instead of fixing everything later. Instead of creating another component from scratch, I'm duplicating the previous one. Now I'm moving the object into place, scaling it slightly, rotating it until everything lines up nicely. Don't worry if this part takes a few attempts. Positioning mechanical parts usually involves a lot of tiny corrections. Sometimes I rotate, then move, then scale, then rotate again. Eventually, everything clicks into place. Rotate it into position. One thing you'll notice throughout this project is that many parts share similar design language. Reusing geometry helps keep everything visually consistent. Delete the faces we no longer need. Now I'll simply bridge the remaining gap. This saves a surprising amount of time. Let's add another cube. Scale it, move it into position. This object is fairly simple, so I'm only adding a couple of edge loops. Now let's extrude this face slightly. Nothing complicated here. We're just giving the piece some thickness. Immediately, it starts feeling less like a placeholder and more like an actual mechanical component. Time for another cylinder. If you've been counting, we've used quite a few cylinders already. That's completely normal. Hard surface modeling often relies on very simple primitive shapes. Rotate it 90 degrees on the x-axis. Scale it. Now let's start shaping it. Extrude the faces. Adjust the profile. Instead of manually filling these openings, I'm using grid fill. Grid fill is incredibly useful whenever you need clean topology across circular openings. Now, I want this section to flow a little more naturally. Rather than moving every single vertex individually, I'm turning on proportional editing. Now, when I move one vertex, the surrounding ones follow smoothly. It's almost like sculpting, except we're still working with clean topology. Small changes here make the object feel much more organic.
Remember the wheel we modeled earlier? Let's reuse it. Rotate it 90 degrees. Move it into position. Scale it until it fits. Again, don't feel guilty about duplicating your own work. Efficiency is part of being a good artist. The goal isn't to spend the maximum amount of time modeling. The goal is to achieve the best result. Now I'm selecting these edges. Instead of leaving them as a mesh, I'm separating them into a new object. Now convert that object into a curve. Why? Because curves make it incredibly easy to create cables and hoses. Once I'm happy with the shape, I'll simply add some thickness, then convert it back into a mesh. Sometimes Blender already has the perfect tool for the job. There's no need to fight the software. Let's add another cube. Scale it down, position it. Now, make sure the pivot point is exactly in the center. This is important because I'm about to duplicate this object several times while rotating it. Press Shift plus D, rotate. Duplicate again, rotate again. You can choose 10 degrees, 15 degrees, or whatever spacing works best for your design. Repeating details like this instantly make mechanical models look much more interesting. Select these top faces, inset them slightly. Now, extrude inward. Scale them down. Next, I'm beveling a couple of edges.
Notice how the highlights immediately become much cleaner. Tiny bevels, huge visual difference.
Let's add another cylinder. Select the outer edge loop, use grid fill once again. Now bevel the surrounding edges. I'm selecting a few faces and circularizing them before filling the remaining opening. Grid fill works much better once the shape is reasonably even. Now, extrude these faces. Now, extrude these faces. Select the front section, inset, extrude, bevel. Little by little, I'm selecting these edges, separating them into another object, extruding them, adding another extrusion, then deleting the hidden faces. Again, if nobody's going to see those faces, there's really no reason to keep them.
At this point, all the major components are in place. From here on, we're mostly polishing the model, fixing little issues, and adding those finishing touches that make everything feel complete. Believe it or not, this is one of my favorite parts of the modeling process. The exciting part isn't creating another cube. It's watching all these individual pieces slowly come together into one complete aircraft. So, let's finish it.
I'm selecting these edges and adding a few supporting edge loops. The purpose here isn't to increase polygon count. It's to control the shape. Whenever you plan on using bevels or subdivision, supporting loops help hold those sharp edges exactly where you want them. Think of them as guardrails. Without them, your nice crisp corner suddenly turns into melted chocolate.
Let's add another cylinder. Rotate it into position. Scale it until it matches the surrounding parts. Again, don't worry if your dimensions are slightly different. If the proportions look good, you're doing it correctly. Now I'll add a couple of edge loops. Extrude this edge loop along the y-axis. Scale it down gradually. Instead of making one huge extrusion, I'm building the form in smaller steps. That usually gives you much better control.
Now I'm selecting these faces and separating them into a new object. Working on smaller objects is much easier than trying to edit everything together. I'll scale these pieces outward slightly, extrude them, then clean up the hidden faces inside. Those faces aren't doing anything except increasing polygon count. So, goodbye.
Let's bevel these edges. Only the ones we actually want. One common beginner mistake is selecting every edge and beveling the entire object. Resist that temptation. Only bevel edges that actually need highlights. Sometimes, less really is more.
I'm selecting a single vertex, duplicating it, separating it. Now I'm extruding and shaping it. Once I'm happy with the profile, I'll convert it into a curve. Add a little thickness, then convert it back into a mesh. Notice how quickly curves let us create clean circular details? Sometimes they're much easier than trying to force everything with polygons. Before duplicating these objects, I'm making sure the pivot point is exactly where I want it. This is incredibly important. If the pivot is even slightly off, your duplicates will rotate in strange circles. Once everything is centered, Shift+D, rotate, duplicate, rotate again. Now we've created evenly spaced mechanical details with almost no effort. Efficiency like this is what speeds up larger projects.
I'm selecting a few edges and marking them as sharp. Next, inset these faces. Extrude them slightly. Add another bevel. Then insert once again. Scale them individually. Move them along the y-axis. These tiny mechanical details might not seem important while modeling, but once materials and lighting are added, they make a huge difference.
inset these faces. Extrude them slightly. Add another bevel. Then insert once again. Scale them individually. Move them along the y-axis. I noticed a couple of n-gons sneaking into the mesh. Let's fix those now. I'm connecting these vertices. Adding another supporting edge loop. Connecting this section as well. If you're ever unsure whether your mesh contains n-gons, here's a useful trick. Go to Select, Select by Trait, Faces by Sides. Blender will instantly highlight faces with more than 4 sides. It's one of those tools I wish I'd learned much earlier. Now, let's scale these faces down slightly. Instead of scaling normally, I'm using Alt-S again. Remember, Alt-S moves geometry along its normals. It's perfect when you want to preserve the existing shape. Now, bevel these edges. Immediately, everything starts looking much smoother. I'll duplicate these faces, separate them, add a subdivision modifier. Inset, extrude, delete the unnecessary faces. Then extrude the remaining edge. This gives us a nice loop-shaped detail. Now I'll simply rotate it, move it into position, adjust the scale, and it fits perfectly.
Now let's add a torus. Adjust the major radius, change the thickness, reduce the segments until it feels right. Rotate it 90 degrees on the y-axis. Sometimes people forget Blender already includes useful primitive shapes. You don't always have to build every circular object from scratch. If a torus solves the problem, use a torus. Blender won't judge you.
I'm taking an existing part, removing its mirror modifier, deleting the unnecessary geometry, scaling it, and adapting it for another purpose. One thing you'll notice in professional workflows, artists recycle their own work constantly. It keeps everything visually consistent and saves a huge amount of time.
This object needs subdivision, so I'm adding another subdivision modifier. Immediately after that, I'm placing supporting edge loops exactly where I want the sharp edges. Subdivision without supporting loops is like drawing with melted crayons. Everything becomes soft. Supporting loops tell Blender exactly where to keep things crisp.
I'm separating these edges. Insetting. Then I notice the normals are flipped. No problem. Select everything. Press Shift-N. Problem solved. Whenever your shading suddenly looks strange, normals are one of the first things worth checking.
A few edges are overlapping here. Instead of ignoring them, let's fix them properly. I'm using G twice to slide the edge, then using grid fill wherever necessary. Small cleanup like this prevents lots of headaches later.
Let's add another cylinder. Delete the unnecessary faces. Bevel these edges. Maybe add another supporting loop if needed. Turn on proportional editing wherever it helps. Again, don't force yourself into using only one technique. Every tool exists for a reason. Use whichever one gives the cleanest result.
Now I'm selecting these objects, pressing Ctrl plus J, combining them into one object. For this section, I'm applying the mirror modifier, removing the center edge, adding another inset, extruding again, using grid fill, beveling the edges. Everything is slowly coming together.
Originally, I moved these pieces manually, but actually, there's a better way. Select everything. Rotate while holding Control. This snaps the rotation into clean increments. Much easier. Much cleaner. Sometimes, halfway through a project, you remember a better workflow. That's completely normal. Learning never really stops.
Now I'm parenting the wheel to the handle assembly. That way, when this part rotates, the wheel follows automatically. Little organizational steps like this make animation much easier later.
Here's an idea you could try. We could add a hydraulic lift mechanism here, something similar to a telescopic piston. Then later, animate it extending toward the ground. Little mechanical animations like that make hard surface models feel much more believable. Maybe that's something we can explore in another tutorial. At this point, I'm mostly duplicating a few existing parts, removing unnecessary modifiers, adjusting rotations, combining objects, adding a few more bevels, dissolving overlapping vertices, applying mirror modifiers where needed, copying modifiers between similar objects using Ctrl+L.
One thing I always recommend before calling a model finished: rotate around it one last time. Zoom in, zoom out, check the silhouette, check the proportions. Look for floating geometry.
Look for overlapping faces. You'll almost always find something worth fixing. Finally, I'm enabling shadows. Not because the model is finished, but because good lighting helps reveal small issues you might otherwise miss. Sometimes the geometry is perfectly fine. It's just the lighting exposing areas that need attention. Looking at every single angle, adjusting rotations, moving objects, scaling a few pieces, tiny corrections everywhere. This stage is less about modeling and more about art direction. Sometimes one small movement completely changes how balanced the aircraft feels. Then I spend another minute simply rotating around the aircraft, looking from every possible angle, making tiny adjustments wherever needed. Before moving on, I'm rotating around the entire aircraft. This is something I encourage you to do constantly. Don't only work from the front view. Don't only work from the side view. Keep orbiting around the model. Sometimes a shape looks perfect from one angle and completely wrong from another. Your camera is your second pair of eyes. Use it.
If you're still following along, first of all, awesome. You're officially getting through one of the biggest hard surface projects on this channel. Take a second to save your file. Seriously, this tutorial is 2 hours long. Let's not trust Blender with unsaved work. We've all learned that lesson the hard way.
At this point, we've added a lot more mechanical detail, reused several existing components to speed up the workflow, created circular assemblies, support pieces, and even started adding smaller design elements that make the aircraft feel much more believable. And that's our stylized aircraft completely modeled. If you've been following along from the beginning, give yourself a pat on the back. This wasn't a 5-minute project. We covered a lot of modeling techniques, from simple primitives and mirror modifiers to topology cleanup, bevels, curves, and plenty of problem solving along the way. I hope this tutorial not only helped you recreate this aircraft, but also taught you a workflow that you can use in your own future projects. Now, we're only halfway through the journey. A great model deserves great textures. So if you'd like to see UV unwrapping, clean UV packing, baking, and the complete texturing process in Adobe Substance 3D Painter, let me know by commenting Part 2 down below. The more Part 2 comments I see, the faster I'll start working on it. And if